River Creek Prison met the October morning with its usual routine. The heavy gates opened at 7:30 sharp, letting in an armored corrections van. Merritt Caldwell watched its approach from the window of her office on the third floor of the administration building, absently stirring her long, cooled coffee. Her office, like herself, was the epitome of order and discipline. Every folder on the massive oak desk lay strictly parallel to the edge. The computer monitor was perfectly aligned. Even the blinds on the windows hung with mathematical precision. In her 25 years in the prison system, Merritt Caldwell had learned to value order above all else. Today's transport brought only one inmate, Fletcher Carmody, transferred from the Nevada State Penitentiary. His file had been on the warden's desk for a week. 34 years old, college-educated, convicted of grand fraud, 15 years. Impeccable behavior, worked in the prison library. Merritt fixed her impeccably styled graying hair and walked down to the reception area. Her heels beat a steady rhythm on the concrete floor. The guards stood at attention as she passed by. She was respected and feared, in that order. Carmody appeared to be a tall, well-built man with regular features and an attentive look in his brown eyes. His hands were cuffed, but he held himself with a kind of quiet dignity. "Welcome to River Creek, Mr. Carmody." Merritt's voice sounded smooth and cold. "I'm the warden, Mrs. Caldwell. We have strict rules, and we expect them to be strictly enforced." "Yes, ma'am," he replied. His voice appeared pleasant, with a slight hoarseness. "You will be working in our library. It's a privilege easily lost. Any infraction and you'll go to the general block." Carmody nodded slightly. A faint smile slid across his face, as if he was amused by his superior's sternness. The library was the pride of River Creek. 15,000 volumes, a computer catalog, a spacious reading room. It was where classes were held for inmates who wanted an education. Merritt personally saw to the paperwork and handed the new inmate over to Warden Dakota Ramsey, a young woman with a military bearing and a keen eye. Back in her office, Merritt looked over Carmody's file one more time. Something about it alarmed her. Perhaps it was that faint smile, or a too direct gaze. Prison was no place to be cocky. That was the first thing you learned behind bars. The day went on as usual. Staff meeting, reports, rounds of the grounds. River Creek lived by its own rules. There was a hierarchy here, both among the prisoners and the staff. Merritt knew all the unwritten rules and knew how to use them to keep order. Toward evening, she saw Carmody again in the library. He was methodically arranging the books, making notes in a journal. His movements were precise and sure, as if he'd been doing it all his life. "How are you settling in?" she asked, stopping at a shelving unit. "The cataloging system is a little different from what I'm used to, but I'll figure it out," he replied without taking a break from his work. "You have a fine collection of classic literature." Merritt hummed. Usually prisoners didn't notice such details on the first day. "I hope you live up to the recommendation," she said dryly, and headed for the exit. "I certainly will, Mrs. Caldwell," he said after her. His voice had that slight sneer in it again. Already in her office, Merritt caught herself rereading his file again. Something was definitely wrong with this Fletcher Carmody, something she couldn't quite put her finger on yet. And Merritt Caldwell didn't like mysteries in her prison. Outside the window, dusk was thickening. River Creek was preparing for lights out. Somewhere in the back of the prison building, a siren sounded, calling the inmates to their cells. Another day was coming to an end. Another inmate had joined the well-oiled system. Merritt didn't know that this day would be the beginning of a story that would change her life forever. A month passed. Fletcher Carmody quickly put the library in order. The catalog was updated with pedantic precision. Books were returned to the shelves on checkout day, and the reading room was always immaculately clean. Even the most fastidious wardens couldn't find anything to complain about. Merritt looked into the library more and more often on the pretext of checking in. She noticed how skillfully Carmody dealt with the other prisoners, never raised his voice, but his requests were obeyed without question. That evening, she stayed in the library longer than usual. Carmody was arranging books in the far corner when she stopped at the shelf of classic literature. "You've reorganized the classics section," she remarked, running her finger along the spines. "Yes, by chronology of works," he echoed, stepping closer. "It's easier to trace the development of literary movements that way." "Interesting approach," Merritt picked up a tattered volume from the shelf. Jane Austen. I haven't reread it in a while. Pride and Prejudice? He sounded genuinely interested. Or Emma. Reason, she paused. Are you well acquainted with her work? Studied English literature at university, he shrugged. Austen was the subject of my thesis. Her understanding of human nature is remarkably accurate. They talked for nearly an hour. Carmody proved to be a great conversationalist, erudite, with a sharp mind and an unexpected sense of humor. He talked about literature with a passion that surprised Merritt. From that evening on, their conversations became regular. They discussed Dickens and Thackeray, argued about modern prose, and shared their impressions of poetry. Merritt caught herself looking forward to these conversations. You don't look like a financial swindler, she once said. What should a financial fraudster look like? He smiled. A man in an expensive suit with a shark smile? Maybe, she looked at him carefully, but definitely not a connoisseur of Victorian literature. Life is full of paradoxes, Mrs. Caldwell. He held her gaze. Sometimes we don't know what we're capable of ourselves. Something flashed in his brown eyes that made her uncomfortable, but that feeling quickly passed. Dakota Ramsey was the first to notice the change in her boss's demeanor. Mrs. Caldwell smiled more often and appeared in the library almost every evening. One day, Dakota heard them laughing, muffled, almost intimate. He's a manipulator, Dr. Frost, the prison doctor, had once said when she and Dakota ran into each other in the dining room. I've seen a few of those. He knows how to make himself comfortable. Dakota remained silent. She was devoted to her boss and wasn't about to discuss her with anyone. Merritt found herself thinking more and more about the library. The quiet evenings among the books, the unhurried conversations, the look in his brown eyes, the challenge in them. She realized that these conversations were beyond the normal interactions between warden and prisoner. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel like following the rules. Have you read this? He asked once, holding out a book to her. Their fingers touched for a moment. Merritt jerked her hand away as if burned. Their breathing could be heard in the silence of the library. It's getting late, she said abruptly. Time to close the library. He nodded silently, but his look told her that this was only the beginning of something she couldn't, or wouldn't, name yet. That night, Merritt couldn't sleep for a long time. She thought about how easily her impeccable reputation could be ruined, how fragile the line between order and chaos was, and how some books were better left closed. But it was too late. The story had begun to write its own plot, and Merritt Caldwell, unwillingly, had become its protagonist. December was unusually cold. The prison walls seemed frozen solid, and even the old heating system could not cope with the biting wind. Merritt stayed late in her office more and more often, poring over documents by the light of the desk lamp. At least that's how she explained her presence in the prison after lights out. That evening, she took a particularly long look at herself in the mirror in the office bathroom. 53 years old. The wrinkles around her eyes had become more noticeable. The gray in her hair was no longer hidden by coloring. Merritt had long ago decided it was a sign of weakness. The austere suit sat flawlessly on her still slender figure. She caught her reflection fixing her hair and felt angry with herself. The walk to the library took exactly 4 minutes. Merritt knew every turn, every security camera, knew there was a security shift in the west hallway between 10 and 10:15, knew that Dakota Ramsey was on duty in the other wing. That knowledge should have been alarming, but somehow it only stirred her blood. Fletcher was waiting for her. He always somehow knew when she was coming. Sitting at the far table, lit by the only lamp, he read. When he heard her footsteps, he looked up and smiled, that special smile that took Merritt's breath away. I was thinking about our conversation yesterday, he began as she sat down across from him, about free will and the predetermination of fate. And what conclusion did you come to? Her voice sounded hoarse, that sometimes our decisions are already made for us. All that remains is to accept them. His fingers slid across the table, almost touching her hand. Merritt didn't pull away. Those are dangerous thoughts, Mr. Carmody. Fletcher, he corrected softly. When we're alone, I'd like to hear my name. She shook her head, but he had already taken her hand in his. His palm was warm and surprisingly soft for a prisoner. This is crazy, she whispered. Perhaps, he agreed. But isn't that the beauty of it? The first kiss happened right then, in the semi-darkness of the library, among the dusty volumes of classic literature. It had been tentative, almost chaste. Fletcher kissed her as if she were a fragile jewel. Then there were other evenings, other kisses, not so innocent anymore. Touches that made her dizzy, whispers in the dark. The constant fear of being discovered only heightened the senses. By day, Merritt was the same as before. A tough, demanding boss. She held meetings, reprimanded negligent employees, inspected cameras. But now there was a mystery in her life that colored the gray, everyday life with bright colors. Fletcher was changing too. In the presence of the other inmates, he was aloof, but once they were alone, the mask fell. He told her about his childhood in a small town in Idaho, about his dreams of becoming a writer, about how his lust for easy money had led him to jail. "I have no regrets," he said one day as they sat in the quiet of the library. "If it hadn't been for all this, I never would have met you." Merritt realized that every time they met was a step into the abyss. She tried to resist the attraction. Several times she decided to stop seeing each other, but every evening her feet carried her to the library. Dr. Frost made more frequent appearances in the administration wing. Her attentive gaze followed Merritt during general meetings. Once she tried to start a conversation about the strange behavior of some of the inmates, but Merritt cut her off halfway through. Dakota Ramsey understood too. One day she ran into the warden outside the library after lights out. Their gazes met, and Merritt saw in the young warden's eyes a silent promise of secrecy. Meanwhile, their relationship with Fletcher was growing deeper. They no longer met only in the library. Merritt's office, empty classrooms, even the old back room, all these places kept their secret. "We should be more careful," Merritt would say after a particularly risky encounter. "Are you scared?" he would ask, kissing her neck. "No," she would answer. And it was true. She wasn't afraid of exposure or embarrassment. She was afraid of what was happening to her heart. Every night, lying in her empty bed, Merritt analyzed the situation. She tried to find the moment when everything changed. When the prisoner Fletcher Carmody had become just Fletcher, a man whose mere sight made her shake. And then the thing she feared most happened. One morning, looking in the mirror, she said it out loud. "I'm in love with him." That confession should have frightened her, sobered her. But instead of fear came a strange relief. It was as if she had finally stopped fighting the current and let the river carry her. That evening she came to the library earlier than usual. It was as if Fletcher sensed the change in her. He didn't say anything, just put his arms around her, pulled her close. And there was more in that embrace than in all the words in the world. Snow was falling outside the library window. Somewhere in the depths of the prison, the heating pipes were humming. Merritt Caldwell, the warden of River Creek Women's Prison, stood in the arms of a prisoner and felt truly alive for the first time in years. She did not yet know that this winter would be the last of her former life, that soon everything would change irrevocably, that the price for these moments of happiness would be unimaginably high. But for now, she just stood there with her eyes closed, listening to the heartbeat of a man she had no right to love. January brought snowstorms and temperatures well over -20. The old prison building was drafty. The prisoners were wrapped in blankets, and the staff tried to stay close to the heaters. But it was as if Merritt didn't notice, a fire burning inside her that no amount of frost could extinguish. Their meetings with Fletcher became almost daily. She had learned to find excuses for late checks, and he always knew how to divert the attention of the other inmates. The library had secluded nooks known only to them, behind the racks of legal books, where the light of the surveillance cameras didn't reach, in a small back room filled with old catalog boxes. "Did you ever think you could do something like this?" he asked once, as they lay on a library plaid spread out on the floor. "To do what exactly?" She ran her finger across his chest, outlining the tattoo, a strange pattern that looked like a Celtic ornament. "On such recklessness, for passion, at the risk of losing everything." Merritt remained silent. She had long ago stopped analyzing her actions. For the first time in her life, she allowed herself to just feel. Dakota Ramsey had first seen them together in mid-January. She was checking the core before lights out and heard a strange noise coming from the library. When she opened the door, she saw her supervisor pressed against a bookcase. Fletcher was kissing her neck and she rolled her head back, closing her eyes. Dakota silently backed away, covering the door. Her cheeks burned, but not from embarrassment, from the realization of responsibility. She remembered how Merritt had saved her career 5 years ago when the young warden had been accused of abuse of power. Now it was time to repay the kindness. From that day on, Dakota became their unspoken guardian. She happened to be in the right corridors, diverted the attention of the other warders, and created safe time slots. Merritt never spoke to her directly about it, but sometimes their gazes met, and the warden nodded slightly, a sign of appreciation and trust. Fletcher had changed too. There was a special softness in his movements when he looked at Merritt. He could spend hours telling her stories about his life, about traveling, about people he'd met, about books that had influenced him. "You know what the most amazing thing is?" he said one night. "I feel more free here with you than I ever did on the outside." Merritt understood him. She too had never felt so alive, so real. It was as if she had worn a mask all her previous life, and now she was finally able to take it off. Their passion was becoming more and more uncontrollable. They took more and more risks, dated longer and longer. One day they almost got caught when Dr. Frost unexpectedly returned to the medical office for her forgotten keys. Fletcher barely had time to hide in a closet. "This madness has to stop," Merritt said then, once the danger was past. "Is this really what you want?" he asked, pulling her to him. She didn't answer. They both knew the answer. In early February, the thing Merritt feared most happened. She began to plan for the future, imagining what would happen when Fletcher was released. There were still 11 years left on his sentence, but she was already dreaming of the lake house, the quiet evenings together, the possibility of just being together. "You've got wrinkles around your eyes when you smile," he remarked once, running his finger over her face. "I'm getting old," she grinned. "You're beautiful," he kissed every wrinkle. "Just the way you are." On those rare nights when she was alone, Merritt tried to imagine how it would all end. Sometimes she thought she saw shadows of the future, dark, frightening shadows. But in the morning, all fears receded. All that remained was the desire to see him, to touch him, to hear his voice. And then something happened that changed everything. One evening, Fletcher was particularly pensive. He was silent for a long time, going over her graying hair, and then he said quietly, "There's something you ought to know about me." But he didn't have time to finish. Footsteps were heard in the hallway, and they had to leave in a hurry. The next day, Merritt received the results of a routine medical examination. Dakota Ramsey later recalled that something changed in the atmosphere of the prison that day. It was as if the temperature had dropped a few more degrees, as if the shadows in the corners had grown thicker, as if fate itself was holding its breath, preparing to strike. But no one knew that a storm was coming that would sweep away everything in its path, and that the price of passion would be unimaginably high. The envelope with the test results lay on Merritt's desk like a ticking time bomb. Dr. Frost had brought it personally, and she could tell by the look on her face that something was wrong. "Have a seat, Mrs. Caldwell." The doctor's voice sounded unaccustomedly soft. Merritt ran her eyes over the lines of the medical report. Numbers, terms, and acronyms blended into a blurry stream. Only 2 words stood out, as if written in blood red: HIV positive. "It's a mistake." Her own voice sounded foreign to her. "We double-checked 3 times. Dr. Frost paused. "Mrs. Caldwell, Merritt, you need to recall all contacts from the last—" "Leave me alone." The order sounded like a whiplash. Left alone, Merritt sat motionless, staring into the space in front of her. Scraps of phrases swirled in her head. "There's something you should know about me. I have no regrets. If it weren't for all this—" Rage came in waves. She remembered every touch, every kiss, every night. He'd known. All this time he'd known. She entered the library at 9 p.m. sharp. Fletcher was reading, sitting at his usual desk. He lifted his head, smiled, and the smile froze on his lips when he saw her face. "You knew." Not a question, a statement. He closed the book slowly. His hands, usually so confident, trembled slightly. Yes. How long ago? 3 years. Learned it in a Nevada prison. Merritt looked at him, and she thought she was seeing him for the first time. A handsome face, attentive brown eyes, a slight gray on his temples. The man she trusted with everything. Why? I fell in love with you. He stood up, trying to move closer. I was afraid of losing you. Don't you dare. Her voice was quiet, but there was steel ringing in it. Don't you dare speak of love. Merritt. You used me. All this talk of books, all these stories. You were just looking for a way to get to me. No, it was all real. Every word, every touch. Every touch was poison, she said in a near whisper. You poisoned me, Fletcher, in every way. He tried to say something, but she held up a hand, stopping him. You know what the worst part is? I actually loved you. For the first time in my life, I let myself... Her voice trailed off. Merritt turned around and walked toward the exit. At the very door, she stopped without turning around. Tomorrow, you'll be transferred to the high security unit. I hope you'll be comfortable there. Merritt, please. She closed the door, cutting off his words. The hallway was dark and cold. Somewhere, water dripped, measuredly, like a metronome. 1, 2, 3. In her office, Merritt pulled Fletcher Carmody's personnel file from the safe. Now she saw what she had missed before. The hints in the characterizations, the odd gaps in the medical records, the transfer from Nevada for health reasons. Her hands didn't shake when she signed the transfer order. Her handwriting was as smooth as ever, only the letters seemed sharper, as if each was a small knife. Dakota Ramsey, when she received the order the next morning, didn't ask a single question. Something in her superior's face stopped all possible words. That night, Merritt did not sleep. She sat in her office, looking out the window at the snow-covered prison yard. Somewhere out there, in a cell, sat the man she loved. The man who had killed her, slowly, calculatingly, with a smile on his lips. In the desk drawer lay a gun, a service weapon she almost never used. Merritt pulled it out, weighed it in her hand. Revenge was a dish served cold. She knew that better than most, and she had a plan. The high-security unit smelled of fear and chlorine. Fletcher knew what awaited him. Over 15 years in various prisons, he'd learned to read the signs. The 2 guards who led him down the humming corridor did not hide their smirks. Their crude jokes echoed off the walls. The new cell was half the size of the old one. A narrow bunk covered with gray, laundered linens. A toilet without a lid. A sink with peeling enamel. And a grate, thick metal bars that divided the world into before and after. Welcome to hell, pretty boy, one of the escorts grinned as he slammed the door shut. This block held the most dangerous criminals. Murderers, rapists, prison gang leaders. Fletcher could hear their voices, hoarse shouts, laughter, threats. The cell across the hall belonged to Roy Butcher Harris, convicted of a triple murder. To the right sat Marcus Wayne, who had beaten 2 guards to death in an Atlanta jail. "Hey, librarian!" someone shouted. "How do you like our suite?" Fletcher was silent. He thought of Merritt, the way she had stood in the library, straight and motionless like a statue. About the way her voice had trembled when she'd spoken of love. About the fact that he really loved her. Perhaps for the first time in his life, he truly loved a woman. The walk in the yard was at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The maximum security prisoners went into a separate pen, fenced in with a double row of barbed wire. Fletcher felt the stares, heavy, assessing, hostile. "Heard you fuck the boss." Roy Harris appeared like a shadow, massive with a scarred face. "Nice job, huh?" "None of your business," Fletcher replied calmly. The blow came in the solar plexus, quick, professional. Fletcher bent in half, gulping frosty air with his mouth. "Mine now." Harris leaned in close to his ear. "Everything that happens here is my business." The guards pretended not to notice anything. Fletcher realized this was just the beginning. News of his affair with the warden had already spread throughout the prison. For men like Harris, it was a gift of fate, an opportunity to put the upstart in his place. In the evening, lying on the hard bunk, Fletcher listened to the sounds of the cell block. Somewhere a prisoner was screaming, like a nightmare. The guard's keys jingled. Water dripped from a faulty faucet. He thought of the library, the smell of old books, the silence of the reading room, the warm evenings with Merritt. It all seemed like another life now, almost a dream. "Hey, Carmody!" Marcus Wayne's voice came through the wall. "You know what they're going to do to you, don't you?" Fletcher knew. There was no room in the prison hierarchy for those who slept with their superiors, especially if it ends in scandal. The next day during lunch, someone accidentally pushed his tray. Hot soup spilled out onto his robe. His soap disappeared in the shower room. Minor bullying, harbingers of greater misfortune. Dakota Ramsey occasionally walked past his cell. Her face was impenetrable, but once she lingered a second longer than usual. "She really loved you." It sounded like a judgment. By the end of the week, Fletcher noticed that the guards were passing his cell less frequently. At certain hours, the corridor seemed to die out. He knew it meant he was in for a surprise. Friday night, he wrote a letter to Merritt. He wrote 3 pages in small handwriting, trying to explain the inexplicable. He told her about his diagnosis, about his fear of loneliness, about how it was impossible to resist her strength and vulnerability, about how every word of love was true. He gave the letter to the young guard, slipping him a stashed pack of cigarettes. He promised to pass it on, but Fletcher knew Merritt would never read it. At lunch on Sunday, he caught Harris's eye. He nodded faintly to someone behind Fletcher's back and smiled slowly, anticipatively. Fletcher realized the time had come. He could have asked for protection, could have tried to negotiate, but something inside him felt petrified. Perhaps it was redemption, maybe it was just fatigue. That night he stared into the darkness of the cell for a long time. Somewhere at the other end of the prison, in his office, sat the woman he loved, who had betrayed him, who now wanted him dead. "Forgive me," he whispered into the darkness, but the darkness did not answer. The morning of February 15th was unusually clear. Merritt Caldwell arrived at the prison earlier than usual. She checked the mail, signed documents, and held a brief meeting with the staff. No one noticed that her right hand occasionally touched the desk drawer where the gun lay. Dakota Ramsey came on shift at 7 in the morning. As she passed Fletcher Carmody's cell, she noticed that he was awake, sitting on his bunk, staring at one point. He had a strange expression on his face, a mixture of doom and determination. At 10 o'clock, Dr. Frost made her rounds. As she entered the high-security cell block, she heard Roy Harris talking softly to his cellmates. Scraps of phrases made her shiver. She wanted to warn her superiors, but then changed her mind. After all, it was none of her business. By lunchtime, the prison was unusually quiet. The prisoners were talking in whispers. The guards were tense. It was as if everyone sensed trouble was coming. At 2 o'clock, Fletcher asked to go to the infirmary, saying he had a bad headache. On the way, he turned down a side corridor. The guard who accompanied him, accidentally, lagged behind for a few minutes. The library was empty. Fletcher walked slowly between the shelves, touching the spines of the books. Everything was still the same here. The smell of paper, the silence, the muted light from the tall windows. Only now it seemed like the setting for a play that was coming to an end. At 3 o'clock, Merritt received a note. "He is in the library." The handwriting was unfamiliar. She folded the paper 4 times and burned it with a lighter. Dakota Ramsey watched a group of prisoners led by Harris move down the hallway. They walked at a leisurely, confident pace, as if they knew exactly where they were going and why. She turned away and began to check her papers. At 3:30, there was a scream in the library. A short, terrible one, as if a man was trying to say something and couldn't. Then there was silence. Merritt sat in her office, slowly going through the papers. Her hands were calm, her breathing even. Only the whitened knuckles gave away her inner tension. At 4 o'clock, a young guard found the body. Fletcher Carmody lay between the shelves among the scattered books. His face was unrecognizably disfigured. Multiple stab wounds darkened his chest. Dr. Frost, examining the body, noted a strange detail. A book was clutched in the dead man's hand. Jane Austen's Reason, a tattered hardcover. Dakota Ramsey watched Harris and his men return to their cell block. Their hands were clean, their robes neatly buttoned. Only their eyes glittered with feverish excitement. At 5 o'clock, the detectives arrived at the prison. Merritt met them in her office. Collected, professional, with a perfectly even voice. She answered questions clearly and matter-of-factly. No one noticed how she covered her eyes for a moment when the detectives mentioned the crime scene. No one saw her lips quiver as they described the condition of the body. Only Dakota Ramsey, standing in the corner of the office, noticed that the supervisor never once said the name of the murdered man. It was as if Fletcher Carmody had already become a ghost one of many that haunted the gloomy corridors of River Creek. By nightfall, the prison had regained its usual order. Only the library was dark, where the police were working. Fluorescent lights illuminated the crime scene, turning blood into black stains on the worn linoleum. In her office, Merritt Caldwell stared out the window at the snow-covered yard. A loaded pistol lay in her desk drawer. She never used it. She didn't have to. Revenge did turn out to be a dish served cold. Detectives Ashton Graves and Sage Malloy arrived in River Creek the morning after the murder. Graves, a large man with a streak in his dark hair, had specialized in prison crimes for 15 years. Malloy was his complete opposite, petite, red-haired, with sharp-looking green eyes. They surveyed the crime scene in silence. The library still bore the marks of last night's tragedy: dried bloodstains on the floor, overturned shelves, scattered books. "Weird," Malloy muttered, squatting down beside a bloodstain. "Look, Ashton, the spatter on the shelving units is angled." "He was hit from top to bottom." Graves nodded. "He was already lying down when the main blows were delivered." "Doesn't look like a spontaneous prison fight. This was an execution." The first person they questioned first was Dr. Frost. The young woman was nervously rubbing the chain of her glasses as she recounted the autopsy results. 23 stab wounds, multiple head injuries. But there's something interesting: handcuff marks on his wrists. He was restrained. "How many people were involved in the murder?" "Based on the nature of the injuries, at least 4. Dakota Ramsey proved to be a difficult witness. She answered briefly, looking somewhere over Malloy's head. "Where were you at the time of the murder?" "Checking paperwork in the administration building." "Did you see anyone suspicious?" "Everyone in prison is suspicious, Detective." Graves noticed how she faltered for a moment when it came to Merritt Caldwell. They left the warden for last. She received them in her office, impeccably dressed, calm, with a perfectly straight back. "Mr. Carmody used to work in the library?" "Yes. He was transferred there after he arrived." "Why was he transferred to a high-security unit a week before his death?" "Regime violation." Her voice didn't waver. Malloy watched her carefully. Something about her superior's demeanor seemed unnatural to her, like a carefully rehearsed play. By evening, they had their first suspect, Roy Harris. His interrogation lasted 3 hours. "Where were you at the time of the murder?" "In my cell. I can provide a dozen witnesses." "Do you have an alibi for every minute of it?" "There's always an alibi in prison, Detective, especially if you have to." Graves and Malloy sat up late into the night, going over the testimony. "Something's not right here." Malloy spread out the crime scene photos. "Look, the book in the victim's hand, The Reasoning of Reason. Why that one? Random, maybe? There are no accidents in prison." She rubbed her tired eyes, especially in murders like this. They didn't realize they were being watched. Merritt stood at the window of her office, watching the detectives walk to the car. Her reflection in the glass seemed ghostly. On the desk was an envelope with the results of her latest HIV test. She didn't bother to open it. Some things were better left unknown. Footsteps sounded outside the door as Dakota Ramsey brought in the evening report. Merritt squared her shoulders and turned toward the door. The game was just beginning. On the third day of the investigation, Sage Malloy had discovered her first lead. Reviewing the security footage, she noticed a strange pattern. On the day of the murder, 4 cameras in the hallway leading to the library went out of service for 30 minutes at a time. "It's not a coincidence," she told Graves. "Someone in the administration helped organize the assassination." They started digging deeper. The guard duty schedule showed unusual changes in the week before the murder. Several experienced wardens had been transferred to other units. They were replaced by rookies who didn't know the internal rules well. The interrogation of the prisoners had become a game of silence. It was as if each of them was reading from an invisible script. Saw nothing. Didn't hear anything. Was in the cell at the time. Only one inmate, a young guy with a tattoo on his neck, casually mentioned, "Harris said it was a gift for the warden." An hour later, he was found in the shower room with his head bashed in, survived by a miracle. Graves and Malloy questioned Dr. Frost again. This time, she was more nervous than usual. "What do you know about Mr. Carmody and Mrs. Caldwell's relationship?" "Yeah, I can't discuss patients' medical records." "This is about murder," Malloy reminded her gently. Frost snapped, told her about the test results, about Carmody's diagnosis, about Merritt's test, about how the supervisor had changed after receiving the results. A picture was beginning to emerge: motive, revenge, a carefully planned murder at the hands of others. But there was no proof. Harris and his men were silent. The guards averted their eyes. Dakota Ramsey stood a wall between the detectives and her boss. "She thought of everything," Graves said, looking at the evidence board. "Used the system against the system." Malloy walked to the window. In the prison yard, Merritt Caldwell was talking to a group of guards. Straight back, confident gestures, a commanding turn of her shoulders. "You know what the worst part is?" asked Sage quietly. She really loved him. Otherwise, she would have just shot him herself. They checked phone records, reviewed emails, interviewed the staff. Nothing, not a single piece of direct evidence, just circumstantial evidence and conjecture. Roy Harris smiled at the last interrogation. "Sometimes bad things happen to bad people, Detective, especially in prison." On the evening of the 9th day of the investigation, Graves and Malloy sat in an empty office looking at file folders. "We know she did it," Malloy said. "Knowing doesn't mean proving it," Graves replied. A crime scene photo lay on the table, the book Reason's Arguments clutched in a dead hand. A final message from the killer, or from the victim. Footsteps sounded in the hallway, the clear, steady tapping of heels. Merritt Caldwell walked through her prison like a queen through a palace. She had won, and she knew it. And somewhere in the depths of the prison corridors, the inmates were whispering, passing from cell to cell a new legend. That of the warden, who knew how to wait and knew how to avenge. The Fletcher Carmody murder case file landed on the district attorney's desk exactly 1 month after the tragedy. Detectives Graves and Malloy presented all the evidence they had collected: camera footage, witness statements, forensics. "Not enough," the DA said, slamming the folder shut. "It's all circumstantial. It'll fall apart in court on the first day." They knew he was right. Merritt Caldwell had built the perfect scheme. No direct contact, no explicit orders. Just random coincidences and odd circumstances. Roy Harris got extra time for murder, but kept quiet during all the interrogations. His accomplices remained silent too. In the prison world, there are scarier things than extra time. Merritt went back to work as if nothing had happened. She was still holding meetings, checking documents, keeping order, only now there was something new in her eyes. Cold, dangerous. The library had been renovated. The new librarian, an elderly man with a quiet voice, put the books in their places. Only the volume of Reason had disappeared. It had been entered into evidence. Dakota Ramsey was the only living witness to that story. She saw Merritt change, as if every day something in her died, giving way to something else, harder, darker. On the last day of the investigation, Sage Malloy came into the warden's office. "You know what we know, don't you?" she said. "It's not what we know that matters in our work," Merritt replied. "It's what we can prove." They stared at each other for a long minute. Two women on opposite sides of the law, but so similar in their understanding of justice. A year passed. River Creek lived its ordinary life. Merritt Caldwell still ran the prison, tough, efficient, flawless. Her gray hair had turned completely white, but her posture remained as straight. In the evenings, she sometimes came into the library, standing between the shelves, touching the spines of books, perhaps reminiscing. Maybe just thinking about the thin line between love and hate. And somewhere in the archives of the Department of Corrections was a file with an unsolved case. On the last page, Detective Malloy had written, "Sometimes justice doesn't come through the law. Sometimes it comes through pain, betrayal, and revenge. And no one knows what the higher price will be, to love and be betrayed, or to take revenge and lose oneself." The case was closed, but the story remains, as a reminder that within the walls of prison, even love can become a deadly weapon.